for that wonderful introduction. And all of you should know that you're here by the good graces and under the auspices of this wonderful free programming. It would be great if you would make an end of year contribution to the enterprise, because as you can see, there are some really amazing speakers who show up here with regularity, and it's an honor for me and a pleasure to learn from them. And it's great that we're virtual in that sense, because where could you have, Gila Fine and Gary Rensburg, within the space of a week? I mean, that's amazing. Whatever debits there are as a result of the pandemic situation. So, B'siyata D'Shemaya, with the help of heaven, begin the book of Shemot. Grave to cradle. Grave to cradle. The book of Genesis ends with a very interesting passage that describes both first Jacob and then Joseph being put ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, right? Being put in sarcophagi in Egypt. And this will be important because the sarcophagus of Joseph will be taken out of Egypt and with the people of Israel when they leave Egypt at Joseph's explicit direction, at Jacob's specific direction. Interestingly, we don't know what happened to Joseph's sarcophagus. Maybe that's a project for the amateur archaeologists among you. But between the time that Jacob is placed in his sarcophagus at the end of the book of Genesis and the time the people of Israel leave and they bring up Jacob's bones with them, there's another incidence of a small person in a small box, and that's the famous story, of course, of Moses set adrift on the Nile River, and of his subsequent history. Now, when I envisioned talking about each of these books at its beginning, I thought, wow, that's a lot. It's a lot to cover the book of Exodus, in one sitting. And so if this series proves interesting or popular, what I thought I would do was go in as I did with Genesis, as far as I can go within the hour that we have. And then next year, perhaps pick up at the same place and continue, because the wonderful thing about reading the Torah is that it constantly cycles and it is constantly new and renewed. Looking this morning, when I was davening, at this very thick calendar I have called Davar Be'ito, which is published by Vizhnitzer Hassidim in Jerusalem, particular gentleman who's a genius of astronomy. He's interested in, the positions of the stars and planets and natural phenomenon, and of every detail of everything that's done liturgically throughout the Jewish year. He admonishes this morning his readers to pay especial attention when reading the beginning of the book of Exodus today and Thursday. The Torah is read Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, as you know, and on all the Shabbatot when we study the book of Exodus, even more so, perhaps, than the previous or subsequent books. And why is that? Because it is a mitzvah, it is a commandment to tell of the Exodus from Egypt on a particular night, which is the night of the Seder. And he says, it's fascinating to read because you get an eye on contemporary Haredi life. He says, given that people are torn in so many directions by their responsibilities and their families, etc., when it comes time to prepare for the moment of that mitzvah on the night of the Seder, people may be too pressed to spend enough time doing it. So he advises that one begins from now to embody and discuss the Exodus, and this is really important. And it strikes me that there's something in Maimonides, in the Rambam's Haggadah, that I never really understood until I read that ha'ara, that note this morning in my calendar, in my contemporary calendar. The Rambam says something very interesting. It says in the Haggadah, it says, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam liros es atzmo keilu shu yatsa miMitzrayim." Right? In each and every generation, one is obligated to view oneself as if one had personally left Egypt. Right? The Rambam has an interesting nosach, an interesting change. He says, B'chol dor vador chayav adam leharos es atzmo. In each and every generation, a person must display oneself as if one had personally come out of Egypt. Display oneself, comport oneself, behave oneself. And it strikes me that, there is a discussion in the Haggadah about the discussion of Exodus, which is infinitely expanded, right? So some people say to discuss the days of the Exodus, all the days of your life, could mean during the day. But actually, since it says all the days of your life, it means the days and the nights, right? And the night of the Seder. And since it says all the days of your life, it means in this present reality and in the coming denouement of history, in the coming messianic reality also, which is important because we might have thought that when the Messiah comes, the world will change and we'll have a series of new holidays and new celebrations and new times of joy. And maybe the Exodus will sort of take a back place. No, say the rabbis, the Exodus is like diamonds forever, okay? So the actual commandment to remember and study and learn about and mention the Exodus is every single day. Right? It's incumbent upon us every single day, which is why when we say the Shema, we remember the Exodus, right? Many, many things are Zecher Yitzias Mitzrayim, in memory of the Exodus. On the Seder night, Maimonides is telling us, the specific mitzvah, the specific commandment is leharos es atzmo, to demonstrate, to play, to portray, to depict, to behave ourselves in a way that evokes that. So there are two components, right? There's the intellectual component, which is for every day, and there's the visceral, physical, performative component, which is for the night of the Seder. And that was just an interesting insight, just on the basis of a calendar note that I read this morning. So, from grave, the sarcophagi in Egypt, to cradle, to Moses's basket, and a little bit beyond today. It's very peculiar that a book that is called the Book of Names, the Sefer Shemot, should begin with a lot of names, right? These are the names of the people at JPS, right? These are the names of the sons, the people of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household. And then in groups, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zevulun, Binyamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, etc., etc. So we do get some names. But look at this very, very strange beginning for the second chapter of the book of Exodus. Vayelech ish mibeis Levi v'yikach es bas Levi. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and the son has no name, right? Nobody has a name. Certain people have names, the tribal ancestors, and in fact, pointedly, the midwives, as we'll see in a second, but nobody in the core story, the story of Moses's babyhood, has a name. And Moses himself only gets a name when he's named by the Egyptian princess, the daughter of Paro, who herself doesn't have a name, right? And the name he receives is not a Hebrew name, but quote unquote, an Egyptian name as far as the text understands it. So there's an ambiguity and a play with names here, right? The ancestors get names, the midwives get names, but then the people in the core story don't get names. But then Moses, who is not named, gets a name, but it's not a Jewish name, but an Egyptian name. So the book of names could probably more effectively be, and this is an observation that Yabes makes, that the critic, the literary critic on the Bible, could be understood as being the book of naming and not naming. And each of those modes, naming and not naming, adds something else to the story. But let's look at the story, okay? So at first, the Israelites increase and they multiply, right? And it's fascinating the way it's articulated. And this is a juncture in the text, chapter 1, verse 7, that is illustrative of the way the rabbis used Midrash to make particular points and to say things about Scripture itself. So if you see in verse 7, Uvnei Yisrael paru v'yishchetzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu bim'od me'od v'timaleh ha'aretz oisam, right? And the people of Israel were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, and the land was filled with them. What does Midrash Rabbah on Shemot say about this? Every live birth of an Israelite woman during the period of enslavement in Egypt consisted of 6 children. Okay. Are we supposed to believe this? Is this a historical truth, right? Where does it come from? Well, if you look at that verse, you'll see that there are 1, fertile, 2, prolific, multiplied, 3, increased, 4, very, very greatly, 6 verbal forms, right, indicating multiplication, right? Now, if given the fact that the Bible is printed, as you see, on toilet paper, essentially, what we call Bible paper, right? If you were writing that verse, how would you have articulated it? You simply would have said, the people of Israel multiplied, right? Because why is the Bible printed on such thin paper? Because if we printed it out on normal weight paper, it would be this thick, right? So if the Bible was looking to conserve language, it would have given us fewer adjectives. But it gives us that many adjectives, and that fact attracts the rabbis like bees to honey. And the rabbis create this midrash that every birth in Egypt was 6 children, which also serves to justify, though not perhaps mathematically explain, the incremental compounding of human numbers from some 70 who go down to 600,000, as the Bible puts it, 600,000 besides the women and children who leave Egypt at the end of the story, right? So are we bound to believe such a thing, such a story, that every birth was 6 children? No, of course not. I don't think there's anybody, including, the ultra-Orthodox people from whence I spring, who actually, believe that as a fact. But it does a number of things. It's aspirational. At a time and a place, Jews in the pre-modern era, the average number of children in Jewish family was something like 2.5, and that wasn't for want of trying. Right, the fact that my cousin Hashi has 13 children and her brother Yitzchak has 14, is a modern phenomenon, right? Mostly a post-World War II phenomenon. The fact is that before the modern period, many children, we should be preserved from this, died, right, in young ages, or women died in childbirth, or children didn't get born, right, because birth is a risky business. So there was some sort of aspirational idea there, but it was also about having fun with the text. I've said this to some of you before, but if we want to understand how the rabbis invent such quote unquote ridiculous fantasies, I would call them fun fantasies, right? But some people are very against the idea of midrash. Imagine it this way, right? You're walking along the street, and coming up to you in the opposite direction is someone, we used to call it this. I mean, I guess most of us are of an age, so I can say someone on whom you have a crush, right? And that person drops a little crinkled up piece of paper, right, on the ground, and walks on, and you pick it up, right? And you open it up, and on it says, purple peonies. What are you supposed to think? So it's like, is this person suggesting that I give them purple peonies, right? Or is this person comparing me to a purple peony, right? Or does this person want to commit outrageous sex acts involving purple peonies, right? Why do you do that? You take it home, you show it to your friends, right? What could this person mean? Blah, blah, blah. Well, you do it because you have a crush on that person, because you're in love with that person. You do it because you feel this desire or connection with these people, this person, right? So for Jews, the Torah was a love letter from God. right? And so they scrutinized the text that way. And if there were 6 adjectives, right, they were curious as to what this meant. By the way, I stand corrected because I saw comments coming up that Moses takes Joseph's bones. Yes, it's Joseph's bones, correct, right? And Jacob is buried in Hebron, correct. Okay, so the multiplication of the Israelites is interesting to me. And then what's especially interesting to me is the story of the midwives, right? So the story of the midwives is marked here because outside of all these illustrious men in chapter 1, verses 2 through 5, we have the first mention of women. And these women, it would seem, sort of on a sociological pyramid, to borrow an Egyptian term, right, are not at the peak of the pyramid. They're midwives, right? So of course the rabbis say that no, these were not just any midwives. These were in fact, Yocheved, Moses's mother ultimately, and Miriam, his sister. And they have these names, Shifra and Puah. And they're wonderful, wonderful names. Actually, so Shifra means is derived in the Midrash from the one who prepares, who smooths, who repairs, so to speak, the baby, right? When the baby emerges, the baby is covered with blood and mucus and all manner of fluids. And Shifra was the one who would sort of clean the baby off and oil its limbs and prepare it for handing back to the mother. It's said that when I was born in 1964, in Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, the legend goes, according to my mother, right? The legend goes that the nurse cleaned me off, handed me to my mother and said, "Here's the professor." Now, that's very odd, right? Because for like most of my life, I wanted to be a garbage man. So I'm really, well, I suppose I am in a way, taking about in the muck, the sacred trash. In any case, Shifra is that nurse who cleans the baby off. And Puah, Miriam, is the one who goes, boop, 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 right? Aren't you cute, right? Who amuses the baby, right? In Hungarian, Puha means soft. So Puha is actually Shifra in Hungarian, but that's another matter. I happen to be married to Hungarian. And so it is these women, though, who really engage in the first act of civil disobedience that is also a religious calling. And it will be echoed later in the book of Exodus, as I hope we'll get to eventually. But here it says, the midwives in verse 17, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, right? They let the boys live. So note a few things. The king of Egypt doesn't have a name. Sometimes he's called Paro, which is not a proper name. It means king of Egypt in Egyptian, right? And here he's just called the king of Egypt, whereas they have names, right? And they have names, but you know, in Hebrew, name is connected with monument, is connected with memory. So you know this term from the prophets, Yad Vashem, right? That is a monument and a name. And of course, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem is called Yad Vashem. When you have a name, you have continuity, you have eternity. And these women get a name because they listen to God and not to Pharaoh, and God rewards them. But this is the first act of religious / political insurrection. And it frames the beginning of the book. And the second half of the book is framed by another act of political / religious insurrection, also against Pharaoh, and that is the Passover sacrifice, which, as we will see either this time or next year, is the first, I guess, public national political act of what do you call it? Political rebellion or revolution that's recorded, right? We have that story. It is both religious and political, and very, very important to note. So this is the first such act. Okay, so we have the multiplication. We have the midwives aiding and abetting in the multiplication. And then we have a very special child born. And this very special child born, of course, is special in our Bible, but is the progenitor of a great number of hagiographic, that is, stories of saints or holy people or great people, births that occur in the New Testament, Jesus, and the Quran, the extra Quranic materials that describe Muhammad's birth as being special. The Buddha is described as someone whose birth was special in some way. And we have the anonymous man of the house of Levi who marries a Levite woman. And then it says, Vatera oto ki tov. She saw the child, that the child was good, tov. So I read years ago when I was, I think, 9 years old, I stole a copy of Louis Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews, actually a book called Legends of the Bible, 1-volume, titration or distillation of the larger magisterial Legends of the Jews. This is a collection of midrashim on the 5 books of Moses and beyond, assembled by Louis Ginsberg, late of the Jewish Theological Seminary, but in fact compiled and translated and annotated by Henrietta Zold, who for years served as his animensis, secretary, writer. She had, talk about people who had crushes. She had a lifelong unrequited crush on Louis Ginsberg, who ignored her, except for her scholarly, capacities for her entire life. So when I think about the Legends of the Jews, I think more of Henrietta Zold than Louis Ginsberg. Anyway, I stole the 1-volume version from my synagogue and read it assiduously. And one of the things that I was astounded to find was that Ginsberg emphasizes that Moses, like Noah before him, was born circumcised. And this is how his parents knew that he was special. His mother knew he was special. What is that based on? Well, it says, V'tere'eoso ki tovhu. So the word tov means good, right? And what can good mean except that he was circumcised? Like the old joke, right? Vayetze Yaakov. How do we know that Jacob wore a yarmulke? Because it says, Vayetze Yaakov, and Jacob went out. Now, would Jacob have gone out without a yarmulke on his head, right? So tov, what can tov mean but circumcised? But look at tov, right? Tov, right? Starts with the letter tet, right? Which is 9, vav, which is 6, and vase, which is 2. 9 plus 6, 9, 10, 11, 15, right? 16, 17, okay, it's a total of 17. I'm sorry, I'm not a math genius. It's a total of 17. Ari, remember that next time you write a paycheck for me. I have no idea what I'm getting, right? So it's a total of 17. Mispar katan, that is, if you reduce the 17 to 1 plus 7, you get 8, which is the day on which a baby boy is circumcised. The rabbis loved words and they loved numbers and anything that they could marshal to enhance or to dignify or to have fun with the text, they did, right? So she hides him, and eventually Pharaoh's daughter finds him. And there's a whole business of midrash around the finding of Moses, which is also fascinating. It says, Vasishaches Ama, she sent out her maidservant to pull in this little basket, this little ark in which Moses was hidden, right? But the word Ama means maidservant, but it also means cubit, right? This cubit. So it says, so every ultra-Orthodox yeshiva kid, or even modern Orthodox ones, I think, they know that what happened was, since Moses was of such great dignity that he could only be touched by royalty, right? That is his own family, which was the Jewish royalty, or Pharaoh's daughter, right? And not by some maidservant. What it really means is Vatsishach Ama, that Pharaoh's daughter sent forth, look at this, I can do it, right? Send forth her cubit, her arms stretched, preternaturally long, and she pulled Moses in from the water, right? So that's, again, a word play, but it has a kind of political bent or political goal. And that goal is to tell us that Moses was that extraordinarily special that nobody could touch him who was of a low rank, even though technically he was a slave or a serf, because that's how he was born. He was in fact royalty and worthy to be touched only by royalty. And I love the fact that when this guy who's going to be the progenitor of the Jewish people, the big Jew, gets his name, it's not a Jewish name. It's like his name is like Sage or Eleanor, right? So I was born at a time and place and to parents for whom it was important that I have a Jewish name, Meir Michael, right? But they gave me an English name as well, Marc Michael. Little Jewish, the Michael part, little Jewish, the fact that I was named after Marc Chagall. And so my name is spelled with a C, not with a K, like the writer of the Gospel of Mark, right? And by the way, my name, Marc Michael Epstein, has 18 letters in it. This was something my mother was very conscientious about. And Moses gets a name like Evan or Rick, right? Right? And it's etymologized to a Jewish name, Kimin Hamayim Mishitiu, right? But what's very important in this story is to understand that the biblical author understands Exodus as at heart a diaspora story, a story about what we would call not so Jewy people developing into Jewy people. Let me explain. God creates the world, as you may remember from the book of Exodus, right? The world screws up royally. And as we discuss the book of Genesis, the primary sin of human beings is not eating some stupid fruit, right? Not even disobeying God. People disobey God every single second of their lives, even pious people, right? How much more so the rest of us, right? This is something that occurs again and again, and you screw up and you repent and you come back to it. We like the heroes of the story who are repentant, like Judah, right? Judah screws up and then he says, oh my God, I screwed up. I'm so sorry. She's more righteous than I am. Why the hell did I say she should be burnt, right? I'm teaching in here in California, so I can't come to the door. Why should I, she's more righteous than I am, right? So we like that kind. We don't like Joseph. Joseph is always right, very arrogant. He ascribes everything to God. He's hyper pious, right? Here we have the story of a guy who gets a name and becomes from 0, I would say, to 100 miles an hour in the course of his lifetime, as I'll show you. The book of Genesis is about these constant screw-ups, and the screw-ups are about the abrogation of personal responsibility. From the first, God says to Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I don't know, the woman you gave me, she gave me a fruit, and Eve says, well, the serpent duped me, right? God says to Cain, where's your brother Abel? Cain says, how should I know? Am I responsible for him? Right? God says to Noah, there's going to be a floody. God says to Noah, there's going to be a floody. Get those children out of the muddy children of the Lord. And Noah says, okay, give me a boat. Right? Noah abrogates his responsibility to everybody except a few friggin' animals. Okay? It's only when Abraham shows up and God says, where are you, so to speak? And Abraham says, here I am. That the question is answered satisfactorily. But then again, Abraham screws up and his family screws up, sibling rivalry and favoritism. And God says, oh my goodness, this whole terrarium, I wiped him out once with the flood. I'm not going to wipe him out again. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take them and their petty personal family problems and put them in a situation where they're going to be beholden, even enslaved to others. And let's see how they do there. Let's see how long it takes them to realize that their problems are first world problems. Let's make them a third world people. Let's put them under the thumb of others and let them work it out. and the experiment continues. And that's the experiment of Exodus. And part of that experiment is that Exodus is an extremely diasporic book, right? When we finish the book of Exodus with the tabernacle in the wilderness and God's presence filling the tabernacle, the people of Israel are not in the land of Israel. They're in no person's land between, Egypt and the land of Israel. Well, actually, between Egypt and the land of Israel. Boy, why does it take them 40 years to get from Egypt to the land of Israel? You ever go any place with Jews, right? So in any case, right? It's a diasporic book, and Moses gets a diasporic name, an Egyptian name, right? And Moses himself is the least Jewy Jew you can conceive of. And so by the time he has grown up, and by the way, like Jesus and like Muhammad, we don't really meet Moses until he's a young man, maybe even in his 30s. And by the time he has grown up, he still has not apparently developed as an Israelite, but it's not his fault because he's lived with the Pharaoh. Let's look closely at chapter 2, verse 11. Sometime after that, and this is after Moses is drawn out of the water, and I love that, he's an infant, and then it says sometime after that, a hell of a lot of time after that. When Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinfolk and witnessed their labors. Now, we don't know who is inserting the detail of the kinfolk. It is probably the author, the omniscient author, right, who knows what's going to happen in the text. So it's the narrator saying kinsfolk, but it also may be Moses recognizing this. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen, okay? And again, this Echav, right? Echav, this idea of his brothers, his kinsmen, it's not clear if it's his family, it's not clear, and Midrash has a lot to say about this, but let's just say generally it's his people. Repeat it again. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Midrash is wonderful on this, right? So why does Moses act in such an angry, impetuous way? Well, Moses is an angry, impetuous guy, right? You don't think that the biblical author understood that there was a parallel between beating the Egyptian here to evil effect and killing the Egyptian here and hitting the rock later in the story to ill effect? Of course, there's absolutely a connection. But the Midrash is great because the rabbis also want to see Moses as the future great leader, want to see Moses as the paradigm of transparent transmission. Moses is eventually called Eved Ne'eman, my faithful servant, says God. So remember, the Israelites are avadim, are enslaved, and God takes them out of slavery, not to make them free people, but to make them enslaved to God. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. Very important to remember. And Moses is not my clear-seeing prophet or my beloved friend, right? Abraham in the Quran is called Al-Halil, right? The beloved friend of God, which is a beautiful way of phrasing it, right? Moses is none of those things. Ne'eman beiti, the faithful one of my household, meaning my household servants, or Eved Ne'eman, a faithful enslaved person, right? And so Moses is, in the rabbi's eyes, even in ovum, even as an egg, right, has these qualities. So where it says, Vayifen Chol V'Chol, Moses looked here and there, the pshat, the simple contextual meaning of the text, obviously is that Moses looked around to see that nobody would see him when he committed this heinous act. But you know what the rabbis say? Vayifen Chol V'Chol, he looked into the courts of the Israelites, the Beis Din, to determine if what he would do was justified manslaughter. And he asked in the Egyptian courts also to determine if his status as a prince would enable him to commit this, justified manslaughter, right? Vayifen Chol V'Chol, he looked around And he kills the guy and he hides in the sand. Next day, he goes out and there are two Israelites fighting, right? Two Hebrews fighting. And so he says to the aggressor, why do you strike your fellow? And the aggressor retorts, Mi samechala ish sar v'shofet aleinu, right? Who put you as a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Now, this is really cool because Moses has been playing this costume drama where he has the SHEMOT on his head and he's wearing a striped skirt and maybe he's holding a staff with a snake on it and a crook and a flail, and he's got eye makeup, and he's going out there and he's playing the Prince of Egypt. You guys in California know any producers? Because we could make a movie called The Prince of Egypt. I think you'd make a note of that, Ari. Thank you. Talk to Spielberg. He goes out there as the Prince of Egypt, right? But these guys know and they see through it immediately. And they say, who made you, who is one of us, into a prince? You're no prince. And a judge, you're no judge over us. Do you mean to kill me, your brother, the way you killed, and this aggressor should have said, the way you killed your fellow, or the way you killed your fellow Egyptian, or the way you killed that other Egyptian, but he says, the way you killed the Egyptian, square brackets, which you are not. And then it says, Vayar Moshe, Vayomer, Vayira Moshe, and Moses was fearful, Vayomer Achen Noida Hadavar. And he said to himself, probably, or maybe even aloud, oh my God, Achen means it's true. The matter is known. Now, what matter is known? So most people would think the matter that you killed this Egyptian is known. But look at the next line. It says, Vayishma Paro es hadavar hazeh, and Pharaoh heard of this matter. Vayivakesh laharoig es Moshe, and he sought to kill Moshe. Vayivrach Moshe mipnei Paro vayeshev be'eretz Midian vayeshev al habe'er. And Moshe escaped from Mitzrayim, from Egypt, and he went to the land of Midian, which is like going to deep Texas, right? And he sat down by a well. By the well, okay? We'll unpack all of that in a second. What is the matter, hadavar, that would occasion such wrath from Pharaoh that Pharaoh would seek to kill Moses? Surely it wasn't his killing of an Egyptian taskmaster. I mean, come on, guys. In the hierarchical pyramid, again, right? Pharaoh is on top. And there's nobody on top of Pharaoh because Pharaoh is the eye in the pyramid, right? Pharaoh is God, right? And then comes the princes and the courtiers, and then comes the army, and then, right? And what's left at the bottom of the pyramid, at the very bottom, are the enslaved people, the serfs, and right above them are the people who couldn't make it into the army, right? So they're detailed to prison, duty, right? They are the taskmasters. So for a prince of Egypt to kill a taskmaster, that's nothing. You study the Code of Hammurabi in high school, right? Or even in junior high school. What happens when a nobleman injures, a commoner injures a nobleman? The commoner is put to death. So it's a life for an eye, so to speak. Right? What happens when a nobleman injures a commoner? Nothing, not even financial compensation. Commoners are like wheat, they're like grass that are designed functionally to be cut down. So the davar that is nada, the thing that is known, cannot possibly be that Moses killed an Egyptian. Egyptians of high rank did this with impunity to other Egyptians at all times. The davar that is nada, the thing that is known, is Moses's Israeliteness. And it occasions Pharaoh's desire to kill him because Pharaoh has decreed already, Kohaben Hanolad, every boy that is born to the Israelites is to be put to death in the Nile, is to be drowned in the Nile. So Pharaoh now knows that Moses is subject to that death sentence. Let's be smart though. Could Pharaoh not have known, that Moses was an Israelite from the beginning? Well, it's possible. It's possible that the daughter of Pharaoh, who is called, by the way, in the Midrash Batya, right? Or Bitya, daughter of God, right? She gets this name for being the righteous savior of Moses. It could have been that she told him, but it could have just as easily been that she didn't tell him. But what's important for Pharaoh, as for all political leaders, is, of course, optics. Achen hadavar noda, the matter is known. Once it's known, Pharaoh will look like a hypocrite if he doesn't put his adopted son to death, because now it's known. And thus Moses has to flee. And he flees as far as he can possibly go. And he flees to the land of Midian, which is like going to Texas in a pandemic, right? All right. And he sits down beside the well. Why doesn't it say a well? Not a well, a well. Why doesn't it say a well? Because, my friends, there's only one well. There's only one well. You know the term, the watering hole, right? I'm going to go down to the watering hole. Why do you go down to the watering hole? To meet girls, to meet guys, to meet girls and guys and girls, to meet people, right? The well is the symbolic nexus of shidduchim in the Hebrew Bible. Particularly in Genesis, we've seen at least two scenes in which matchmaking occurs at the well, because the well is the symbolic nexus for all things that run deep and underlying and nurture us and water us, and that are rich and rewarding, not because of how they look externally, a pile of stones, right? But because of what we can draw up from their depths. And so Moses goes to the well and he sits down. And what happens? And now I'll paraphrase. Well, the daughters of the local pastor show up, right? The daughters of the local pastor, the beautiful daughters of the local pastor. It's Texas, right? And they come to the well and they start to water their sheep, but then a bunch of toughs come and try to sexually harass them. And Moses drives them away, right? And they water their sheep and they go home. They obviously ask, they perhaps in their modesty don't ask who this kind stranger is. And they come home to their father, the pastor, Jethro, Kohen Midian, the priest of Midian, the priest of the pagan polytheistic religion of Midian, right? To whom this session is dedicated. Thank you, Ari. And he says, "Oh, you're home early today." And they say, "Yeah." And he says, "What happened? Didn't they harass you?" It's so typical of some context that, harassment is so common that a father would say to the kids, "Oh, well, what, you're home early? They didn't harass you?" Right? Instead of thinking what could be done about the harassment. Terrible, but there it is. And they say, "Well, yeah, we got home early because somebody saved us." And he says, "Who saved you?" And they say, "An Egyptian man." Imagine that. Our Moses, the big Jew, the guy with the Charlton Heston beard and the staff and the bathrobe and the whole business and the sandals and talking in a portentous voice. Our Moses with the tablets that Patrick Garrow has stolen, behind him, right? That Moses, right? They describe him as an Egyptian man. That means that Moses walks, right? Remember, walk like an Egyptian, talks and looks and smells and sounds like an Egyptian. Our Moses. Ultimate diasporic book. And then the best part of the whole story, which I've left for the last 6 minutes. We didn't get very far into Exodus this year, Ari, I'm afraid. It's a little bit, it's going to necessitate. Look at chapter 3. Okay, I love this. I love this. I talked about it before once for CSP for a much smaller group. So if I repeat myself, you'll forgive me. But I just love this so much. Look, now Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law Yitro, the priest of Midian. I love the biblical author. The biblical author has to all the time rub it in, right? Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law, a big goy. Right, Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law, a big goyish pastor, right? It's crazy, some crazy stuff, right? Drove the flock into the wilderness, right? And then, of course, the translation is insufficient. It says, "Vayinag es hatzayin ochar hamidbar," and he brought the flock into beyond the wilderness. So in Hebrew, the word midbar is falsely etymologized by the rabbis to the root ledaber, to speak, because the desert, empty of gold and silver and buildings and architecture and people, and right, the desert or the wilderness is a place of speech. It's the place where God speaks, right? To Moses, eventually to Jesus, eventually to Muhammad, right? It's a place that's empty of distractions and where God speaks. But Moses goes beyond the wilderness, the Achar Hamidbar, beyond the place of words. And what does he see? He raises his eyes and he sees a bush that is burning, but is not consumed. And then it's so brilliant, right? Moses said, verse 3, I must turn aside and look at this very interesting phenomenon. Why doesn't the bush burn up? Moses is like, I don't know if it was me, because I'm, look, I wear yarmulke. I'm deeply, religiously observant. If a burning bush that wasn't consumed appeared before me, I would throw myself down on the ground and genuflect and prostrate myself and say, "Oh God, what do you wish of me?" But Moses is like, I must turn aside and observe this interesting scientific phenomenon. The bush is burning, but it's on fire, but it's not burning up. And God says, Moses. And you know what Moses says? Moses says, maybe the root system goes down very deep, or the water table is high here. And God says again, Moses, right? And Moses doesn't answer. He's too busy observing the scientific phenomenon. And God says, put your cell phone away in shul, because this is a special place. In other words, don't you even take your shoes off your feet because you are standing on holy ground. Don't you even know what it means to be in a sacred space? And God says, I am. It says, I am, he said. Okay, so God thought, okay, well, this guy Moses doesn't know how to behave in shul. He's got a scientific rather than a religious mind. Fine, I'll pull out the big guns. I will say the word, right? What is the word? Anochi. Anochi is the word I. Unique of God, right? Very special. The 10 Commandments, stolen by Patrick Garrell, right above his head to the right, says the word Anochi. I, the Lord, am your God. Anochi, right? And this isn't even a Hebrew word, the rabbis say. It's a Middle Egyptian word, right? Why? Because if God said I in the Hebrew language, the language with which the world was created, everything would fall into dust and chaos. And God tries to pull this, says, I am. Moses is like, yeah. That's why it says Anochi, right? Vayomer, right? Anochi, right? And then God says, I am the God of your father. Moses is like, well, frankly, I don't know who my father was. Okay. He says, I'm the God of Abraham. No, never heard of him. The God of Isaac? Who? The God of Jacob? V'yisater Moshe panav ki yira mihabit el Elohim. As soon as Zayde was mentioned, Moses hides his face because he's afraid to look into the face of God. So beautiful. You think that Moses is the big Jew, the arch Yid. Moses is like, maybe not like you're here, but maybe like your grandson Sean, your granddaughter Iris, right? Moses is just a guy and doesn't know anything about this God business or how to behave in shul or the difference between divine intervention and science. Doesn't even know about Abraham or Isaac. But when Zayde's name is mentioned, Moses is with it. But his reaction? Fear. Fear, trembling, and the desire to get a really cool magic trick. And it's with that we'll continue next year. The beginning of the book of Exodus, folks. Thank you, Ari.
Great cliffhanger. So a few quick questions before we let you go. Number one, those of you who don't know, Marc is not in his office at Poughkeepsie. He's in a small office in his home because he has a big, he deserves a bigger office at the university. That's a small.
Send money to Ari. Ari will send me more money. I'll get a bigger office.
And the unicorn tapestry behind Marc's head is from the cloisters. I got to see it. Marc loves it for some reason. Maybe one day he'll explain that to us. Okay, question number one. So we call it SHEMOT, and we talked about names. Thank you for that exegesis you gave us. Why is it called Exodus then, to most people who don't know the Hebrew?
So
where did that come from?
So the Greek and Latin names of the books are thematic names. The Hebrew names mostly have to do with the first word or the first important phrase in the book. And that simply has to do, I think, with, well, actually, I was going to say what I think it has to do with, but I'm not sure. That's a very good question. What does that say about the Greco-Roman Latin Christian eventually mindset versus the Jewish mindset, right? Or it may have to do with manuscript culture in that, for the facility of showing, in a manuscript where the story shifts from one book to another, there's no way of indicating it with large letters, or you leave a certain amount of space in a Torah scroll, of course, but maybe it's important to emphasize from at a time when books were written by hand, you put the first word or the first important phrase in larger letters. And but it seems like the Latin Christians were interested more in the themes of the book. So Genesis is creation. Exodus means to go forth, right? So Leviticus means priestly things. Numbers means censuses, and Deuteronomy means the repetition of the Torah, right? So they're the themes versus Bereshit, the first word, Shemot, the second word of the second book, Vayikra, the first word of the third book, Bamidbar, the fifth word of the fourth book, and Devarim, the second word of the fifth book. That was boring. Ask a better question.
Thank you.
Another
question. We spent some time with Sharon Keller looking at the.
I don't mean the question was boring. I mean the answer I gave was boring. Go ahead.
Okay. We spent some time with Sharon Keller looking at the stories from Genesis that had similar stories in other traditions: Noah, the flood, creation, and so on. Where did we get this story from? Is this story about Joseph a story that was similar to other stories?
Moses? You mean Moses?
Moses, sorry.
Right.
Moses. Is the Moses story a similar story, of a person being
right? So I'm not from the Sharon Keller school. I don't believe that there was a lot of material out there, and the authors of the Hebrew Bible hopped the material. I kind of view the Hebrew Bible as its own thing that, of course, maybe she looks at it this way too. I'm not being fair if I don't know. That, of course, wears the clothes of the culture in which it exists. So what there are sort of miraculous birth stories in the Gilgamesh epic and other Akkadian Sumerian materials, but they really emphasize the godly quality of the protagonist. What's interesting about the Hebrew Bible is that if it reflects what's going on in the culture around it, it really tweaks it to go in a particular direction. And what is very central to the Genesis and the Exodus narratives is the humanization of these characters, right? Moses is, as you saw, right? Would you choose as the progenitor, the former, the lawgiver, the protagonist of your religion, a person who really had zilch God consciousness, right? And as far as he knew, no yichus, right? So there's a it's not like the gods come down from heaven and manifest themselves on earth. So the Moses narrative and many of the narratives in Genesis are in a way counter narratives or narratives that are built to tell a particular story that is our story, and they are demystified in a certain way here. Even the plagues in Egypt, which we'll probably get to in year 3 of this discussion, the plagues, if we're all alive, the plagues in Egypt are all phenomena in a sense of the natural world, right? It's not that God sends down horned, 3-headed rams with purple stinging tails, as you might find in Sumerian literature, right? It's all comes from the natural world. It's intended to be made believable and relatable. I hate that word, but relatable. Yes.
So kind of related, Jeff Kaufman wants to know your thoughts on the Cecil B. DeMille portrayal of Moses then in the movie, which I know you watch every year before Easter. Before yes. Easter.
No, before my kids are forced to watch it every year while we're cleaning for Pesach, but now they're all too old to watch it. So it's an interesting film because it was created during the Red Scare in Hollywood. It has a lot of political implications. It says a lot about the Second World War and its aftermath. And it portrays Moses as a proto-Christian savior. So there's a lot going on there that is Midrash, it's not Jewish Midrash. On the other hand, in many of its details and many of its intricacies, it was based very much on the consultants who included Cecil Roth, who was a famous Anglo-Jewish historian of a long ago time in England, and other rabbinic consultants. So it's an interesting and odd mix, but my favorite part always, of course, is Moses's foster mother and his own mother saying over and over in this mid-Atlantic accent, Moses, Moses, right? So that's what I have to say. It's complicated, as they say on Facebook.
I was looking at the comment from Jeff. He said the only character who's actually the actor is Jewish in that film plays the evil character.
Edward G. Robinson, yes, who was actually blacklisted at a certain point. Yes.
Okay, so there are different comments. There people are playing around with the name Moses. You said it specifically is not a Jewish name, but people said, well, it says Min Hamayim Mishitihu. Is that the so maybe it comes from there. So maybe it is Hebrew, but Moses and Ramses, Moses. Moses is most definitely probably not a Jewish name. I think it is interesting that our leader, the most important leader we have in Jewish history, one of the most important leaders, certainly in the top, whatever it is a completely assimilated Jew, right? Is that what you were trying to tell us? I mean, if he grew up in the palace, he was not learning,
Although
there was no Chumash then, so maybe I don't know what he would learn. But
although the rabbis insisted that he was secretly taught by his mother, that's another strand. So let me just you hold the rest of your question. I want to comment on the beginning of the question. First of all, the Torah itself gives a Hebraistic etymology for Moses's name, but it also wants to imply that it is an Egyptian name, and there's a lot of work on the name Moses and is it Egyptian, etc. So there's that. Is it Jewish? Is it Hebrew? Is it Egyptian? Then there's Was Moses oblivious? Was he learned? This has a parallel in the way people think about, in scholarship, think about Jesus. Was Jesus a learned guy who could fight his way through, issues of Jewish law? Or was he a very simple peasanty guy? What you believe about Jesus has a lot to do with your theology. He's a simple peasanty guy, and yet he can answer all these questions, therefore he must be God, right? Or he's really very learned in the laws of his times, therefore he must be a Jew, right? And so what you think about Moses says a lot about what you think about Judaism and its their origin. So there are both strands, Ari. You have people who say Moses was oblivious to his origin, and people who say he was deeply learned. Okay, go ahead.
I just say whenever I meet someone named Sean now, I'm going to think about Moses. I want to thank you for that.
You're welcome.
That teaching test. No, I think we're really out of time. You took us on, let's see, we got through what, 3 pages of SHEMOT?
Yeah, I have to answer Renee though. I have to answer Renee though. Okay, Renee says, finally, when God speaks to Moses at the bush, God reveals God's name. And because God doesn't want to tell Moses God's name, because God's name is the whole Torah. God's name is the whole universe, right? But since Moses is insisting on a magic trick, God gives him a magic trick. And since Moses is insisting on a name, God says, you know what? You can call me this. I am being what I am becoming. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. Okay? I am being what I am becoming. That is, I am a verb. God is a verb. And that is the lesson of that word. And we may start with that when we continue next year. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. But we now go to really your favorite book of the Bible, Vayikra.
Wonderful book.
Leviticus. So we'll see you in what? How long is it going to take to get through Exodus? 2 weeks. That's it.
No, a few weeks.
Okay. It's not really possible in 2 weeks to get through it all.
Right. So let's wait. We should so they can put it on their calendars. We should tell them. Hey, let me.
What is it?
I'm looking because I didn't have my calendar up.
You're invited back. We're going to get through all these books. Mark and I have put it on the calendar. It's the same crazy time. I think it's 11 a.m. I don't know why.
Okay, here we go.
California time.
So the next one second. It's not appearing. 1 second.
I'll email everybody.
Email everybody. I don't want to end this on an anti climax.
No. Well, this is what we're going to tell people. When you go to Shoulder Shabbos and the
Monday, the 21st of February. Monday, the 21st of February. We'll talk about Leviticus. When you go to Shul on Shabbos, Ari, go ahead.
And most of people won't. But if they do,
including myself, who has Shul in his living room.
Maybe they'll go online. Maybe they'll go in person. Do something. It's the book of Exodus. So now you have impetus to go. You can read the whole story there. You can think of what Mark's teaching. You can agree with him or disagree with him. If you disagree with him, I'll give you his address, his phone number, and you can, as I said, just show up and you can argue with him at his stoop. It's no problem. He loves that.
I love that. Right.
Make sure there are a bunch of students watching you and have someone with a camera doing like a live stream because we can put it on Facebook that way too. But go to Shul and know that Rosa Berman at Sinai Temple in LA is giving the Devar Torah, I think, on Parshat Shemot. So you can also maybe tune in and hear Rosa give her Devar. She's not paying attention to me because I can see her on the screen, but just know you can email Rosa and maybe she'll send you her notes as well. She sent me her notes. With that, everybody, I got to take care of my little guy and get to some work. So Dalia Podwal will be teaching Parsha Shavua this week if you're at Congregation B'nai Israel. So maybe some of you are educators and you got some more material. Maybe some of you are listeners and you've learned a lot. Either way, thank you for spending an hour and 13 minutes with us today.
And
we'll see you soon.
Patrick Garrell, give back the 10 Commandments.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Hopefully Patrick will remain, a fan of CSB. Okay, bye. Bye, everybody. Take care. Nice spending time with you.